Well, I titled the lesson, Are We Walking Hand in Hand? Of course, we know hand in hand is with the Lord, so are we walking hand in hand with God? The book of Judges features accounts of several leaders, or they call them judges at that time, who arose to rescue Israel from foreign oppressions during a time period from 1380 BC to about 1050 BC. These stories paint a picture of a dreary pattern. The Israelites sinned. God punished them with foreign oppression. The Israelites repented. God sent a deliverer. Peace followed thereafter. And Gideon is the person we're going to talk about today. And they think he was the fifth of the 14 judges that they're listing in the book of Judges. He served in this capacity as a leader, as a judge, and he is facing the Mennonites. That is who he is coming against, or who has come against Israel. So we'll begin our lesson in chapter 6. And if you want to read the whole story about Gideon, you find him in chapters 6 through 8. And not in our lesson today. Today is more of his call. And if you want to read what he actually did with the Lord's help, it's basically in chapters 7 and 8. But that's about the only part you'll find is those 3 chapters. So we'll begin with chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. And Carol, do you mind reading 1 and 2?
And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains, and caves, and strongholds.
So the book of Judges begins with an account of the deliverer judges, referring to the evil that the nation of Israel had engaged in. And this is basically the cycle that they talk about. So these were their evil actions. First, they participated in sin, or they simply sinned. Then, they made supplication. They were served. They were under servitude. They were slaves, whoever was oppressing them at that time. Then they made supplication. We call that prayer, asking God, seeking God at that point. And finally, once God answered their prayers, they had salvation. So you can see this done in different ways. As I told you in the introduction, they gave you 5 things. This gives you 4 S's to think of, so it's this cycle. Think of a face clock. They start at 12 o'clock in prosperity, and because of their sinning, they go to 3 o'clock, so to speak. They're in deep servitude at 6 o'clock. They cry out, and then God will restore. So you see this cycle throughout the Bible. But this suffering, this time, was very short. Most of them were long periods. But this suffering only lasted 7 years. It said the evil of the children that they did, no one really knows. But they boil it down to this. When you read about doing evil in the sight of the Lord, they simply come to the conclusion that basically it deals with idolatry, idol worship. They looked at the nations around them, and they still worship idols, even knowing what God has done for them. And then, when you look at verse 2, they are not living out like we do in houses and farmlands and flatlands. They are hiding in caves, mountains. They call them dens. And so they would flee there for refuge. And if they weren't in a cave, then they said would find a stronghold, which is probably a place that was more defendable. But they were not living, like I said, out in the flatland. And they had to guard their food, because every time the food got ripe, that's when the Midianites would come in and take it. So this sets up the story of what's going to happen. And at this point, Gideon has not been called. We are learning background information as to what's going to happen and who God is going to use. So then we jump to verses 7 and 8. So let's see what happens there. Jeanette, can you read 7 and 8?
Yes, ma'am. And it came to pass when the children of Israel cried to the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet unto the children of Israel, who said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you forth out of the house of bondage.
So this pattern of deliverance involved Israel pleading for help. And so the first time that they plead for help, God answers in the form of a prophet. He sends an unnamed prophet to challenge them, to bring the word that he will ultimately deliver his people. The prophet's message is grounded in Israel's core story. Everything goes back to the book of Exodus. I can't even talk this morning. The story of the Exodus. This phrase, house of bondage, we all know where it comes from. It comes from being in Egypt all those 400 years. And what did God do there? He delivered them. Remember the cloud and by day and the fire by night? And they went across on dry land, and the Egyptians got swallowed up. So they know this story, okay? And however, it's been 250 years since that has happened. We like to forget things. And we do forget things. Okay? So the prophet's reminding them here, he says, because we go back and look at verse 8, he says, "Thus saith the Lord, I brought you out of bondage." Now the I in this case is God. Anytime when you're reading these prophets, and they start talking about I will, that is God. You can put God in the place of it, even though we don't rewrite the Bible, but the I's do stand for the Lord. And so the Israelites did not need a reminder of being oppressed, because they were being oppressed. And they were fleeing for their lives. However, they did need a reminder. They needed a reminder that the prophet was telling them, remember who had delivered your ancestors. Who brought you out of Egypt? Who led you in the wilderness? Who provided for you those 40 years? Who is providing for you now? We know who. They should have remembered who, but they apparently have forgotten. Verse 9 and 10, Maxine.
"And I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all that oppressed you, and drave them out from before you, and gave you the land. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God. Fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell, that ye have not obeyed my voice."
So the deliverance, consisted in two parts, the Exodus and the settlement. They left one place and they settled somewhere else. And where did they settle? They settled in the land that God gave them. Everything that pertains to them is this gift that God gave them, and God gave them this land. So he made it possible for the people to enjoy their relationship with God and their rhythm of holy life. God had driven out the pagan population in order to make possible for the people's deliverance to be so they could be placed in this land. When the Israelites imitated the people that they had displaced, engaging in idol worship, they thereby disowned their Redeemer. So the point, or the Lord displaced the Amorites to make room for the Israelites, pointed to their loyalty. As long as they were loyal, God was with them. And guess what? Even when they're not loyal, God is still with them. But they don't see it that way, and neither do we. So, they had seen what God had done. God was with them. The prophet is telling them that. But it just doesn't sink in, and they don't listen. So since the Lord had demonstrated his power in forming and settling Israel as a nation, it made no sense for them to fear these idol worships. As a matter of fact, these idols, when you read about them, they can't see, they can't talk, they can't feel, they can't walk, because they are carved by what? Man's hands. And they say that when you read about it, they come from wood, and what do you do with leftover wood? 9 times out of 10 you burn it. So they had carved these, just like the golden calf that Aaron made at the foot of the mountain when Moses is getting the word. That calf didn't deliver them out of Egypt. That calf didn't lead them to get to Mount Sinai. God did, with a cloud of fire, a fire by night and a cloud by day. And yet, as soon as Moses is up there and stayed up there too long, in their opinion, they make an idol. And let's worship that. Well, we saw what happened there too. But in this case, they have seen what God can do. But yet they turn to idols. And again, they go on and tell you that perhaps worshiping one God was maybe foreign to them. They're still maybe recalling what had happened in Egypt when they had all those other gods. But it said to worship one God was highly unusual. And as you read throughout the Old Testament, you will find the word gods, G-O-D-S, with a small letter, occurring over 200 times. And that's what they call these idols. You'll see as gods, okay? So adultery was an act of disloyalty. And when Israel adopted pagan cultural practices, they abandoned their religion that Moses had led them to decades earlier. Then disaster would befall them, and they would go again into bondage. So every time they took their eyes off the Lord, that cycle followed. As long as their eyes were on the Lord, they had peace and prosperity. As soon as they took their eyes off the Lord, sin came in, servitude came in, oppression came in, and some bondages were a lot more than 7 years. 400 in Egypt, 70 in Babylon, other places, other length of time. All right, verse 11 and 12. Kim.
And there came an angel of the Lord, and sat under an oak which was an oak that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor.
Now, the first one that God had sent was a prophet. We don't know who it was. And he called to his mind, remember what the Lord has done. Well, now, an angel of the Lord shows up. And this second scene is a story that involves a different sort of messenger, a heavenly being, and all of a sudden he is sitting under an oak tree. Can you imagine that? I don't know where the oak tree would be, but Gideon's out here thrashing wheat, and he sits under this oak tree. It tells you there are two towns called Ophrah. One is located in the tribal territory of Benjamin, which is about a dozen miles northeast of Jerusalem, or what will eventually be called Jerusalem. The other Ophrah, the one we're looking at here, is from the tribe of Manasseh. And it's also, when you read about it, you'll see the word Gilead. So sometimes you'll see Ophrah, sometimes you'll see Gilead, and it's the very same town. So under the oak tree, this heavenly being is sitting, and we realize it is the property of Joash, that's Gideon's father, and Gideon will eventually inherit it by the way it reads, because it says it will pass on to Gideon. That means when Joash dies, he will inherit it. So, what time of the year it is? Well, it is threshing wheat time, which they tell you here happens between May and early June. Okay, like when we get out here and start planting gardens. So what is the point of knowing this? Well, here's the point. That Gideon felt the need to hide his wheat indicates the oppressive treatments from the Midianites regarding their crops. Because every time their crops got ripe, the Midianites would come in and steal their food. That's why they're hiding in caves and dens and strongholds. Okay? So the heavenly messenger, he greeted Gideon. Gideon's out there thrashing wheat. He's sitting under an oak tree, and he speaks to him. And what does he say? The Lord is with thee. He doesn't tell him anything about his past. At this point, he doesn't tell him what's going to happen in the future. He just says, God is with you. And then he says this, and Gideon is not this at this time. He says, you are a man of valor. Bravery. If you don't like valor, that word means bravery. So he greets him, and he foreshadows what Gideon is going to be. Because Gideon is not this right now. Okay? And by saying that, he will be a man of bravery. It tells you that the Lord is with thee occurs very rarely in the Bible, and in two places it does occur is one when the angel speaks to Mary, telling her she is going to conceive the Lord Jesus, and the other one is to Nathan when he goes and confronts David. And I'm not going into that story. However, similar phrases, they change the wording just a bit. So, okay, so it's here and it's those other two cases. But when you go read the other places, and they gave you one here in 2 Chronicles, and I'll just read that to you. The Lord is with you, okay, while ye be with him. And if ye seek him, he will be found of you, because if you forsake him, he will forsake you. So what they're saying is, when you go to look up this phrase, they may change one word. Instead of saying, the Lord is with you, he says, you know, he might say God is with thee. They changed one word, but the same phrase, the same meaning was in there more than once. You can find it throughout the Bible, and they gave you some other references there that you can look up that I did not. But that phrase, that exact phrase, is not there. Variations of it you can find. You can find the exact phrase in 3 places. You can find other variations in other places. Okay. All right. Verse 13, Sylvia.
And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is this befallen us? And where be all the miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now God. Now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hand of the Midianites.
Well, you're told here that he kind of has a cynical response, a message reflected in despair. However, we know the Midianites' oppression is due from Israel's sin. And what was Israel's sin? Read back in verse 1. We just read it. They did evil in the sight of the Lord, and I put they, when we do evil in the sight of the Lord, it's as prevalent today as it was back then. In other words, we take our eyes off of God, and what happens? We're like in that whirlpool going down the water drain, and we'll be sucked in a heartbeat, and then disaster falls. And so and when you're living it or going through it, you know, it's kind of hard to say, oh yeah, God's going to bring me out of this. Well, I'm in this situation right now and I need help. So that's why they say he's being a little bit cynical, and according to your commentary. But I put, verse 1 tells us, and they did. And every time, what did it say? They built idols. So when they built idols, they had idolatry. Well, isn't that taking their eyes off of God? Has God left them? No. Who did the leaving? They did. But right now, when we're feeling this, we feel like he's left us. Well, let's read on. So this sort of protest appears quite often in the Bible. But Gideon's question should not strike us as rude, much less unfaithful, but as a heartfelt attempt to make sense of his experiences. And I wrote, we do the very same thing. Unless we forget, we will do the very same thing. And we'll be in the very same situation. So Moses had encouraged the parents to teach the children about the experiences of deliverance. They've got all this. They know the law. They know the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, up to this point, where we are, 4 books. No, we've read all 5 of them. We're in Judges, so they know this. They know about the literature that has been written about God's deeds that they entrust from their ancestors. However, Gideon could not resolve the apparent disconnect between then, 250 plus years ago, and right now in his situation. And guess what? I think we're in the same boat. We can't picture it then, and we're right now in the very same situation. Okay? All right, verse 14. Susan.
And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go, in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee?
So Gideon's call to become the deliverer bears similarities to those of Moses. This thy might seems strange. Gideon has no might. Okay? He's just a plain simple farmer, so to speak, out here thrashing wheat. Perhaps the answer lies in verse 13. Gideon knew this Exodus story. They all knew the Exodus story about their ancestors. The strength that Gideon desired would fill him as he went, as God sent him. Just like we heard last week with the 10 lepers. As they went to the priest, what happened to them? They were healed. What did they have to do in order to get the healing? They had to go. Nathan, I think his name was Nathan. No, his name wasn't Nathan. He was another oppression king, warrior general. And Elijah tells him to go wash in the Jordan. And he doesn't want to. So his second in command, or his general, whatever was happening, he says, if he had told you to do this, you'd go. He said, why don't you go and wash? What happened when he obeyed? The leprosy left him. So, in this point here, as God sent him, as he would go, God was with him. Okay. And then our final two verses, because we've got our call here, so let's see how he wraps this up. And like I said, you can finish reading the story in chapter 7 and 8. And Susan, will you read 15 and 16? I'm sorry, not Susan, Sandra.
Okay. And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in the matter, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, surely I will be with thee.
When I first read 15, what did that make you think of? Moses? I can't go, I can't speak. What did he say there? Oh, how can I save Israel? I'm poor. I'm from a tiny little tribe. Just that quick he forgot God said, I'll be with you. That quick he forgot what the angel said. He said, you'll be a mighty man of valor. That did sound like Moses. He made excuses. However, he doesn't get by with it. We don't either. So Gideon objected to the call on the basis of his insignificant lineage. When Gideon pointed to the insignificance of his family, he was not simply being modest. It was from a small tribe. It was the half tribe of Joseph's two offspring, with no great military support. However, he had something greater. He didn't have a military army, but he had something greater. He had God. And here's God's response in the first part of verse 16. I will surely be with you. A while ago we read that phrase. He said he would be with thee. Here it is, but it's just a little bit changed, just a little variation. But God's response was, I will be with you. And that is still the greatest response for us today. God is with us. So when he calls us to do something, he is with us. Our text today begins with an account of how Israel experienced deliverance from an oppression. God had delivered in the past, but he didn't seem willing to do so now. Our hero, Gideon, gets to express confusion that the readers must also feel, that we may still feel when our beliefs and our experiences seem to clash. We probably just had an example of that with this hurricane coming up the coast. Why all of this destruction? I think we've got the answer in verse 1. We have done evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, getting our attention. Maybe that's off target just a little bit, but anyway, when we do evil in the sight of the Lord, disaster happens. When that happens, we get stuck asking why, just as Gideon did. We can ask why, but we have to get out of that cycle, not stay there forever. It is important to note what is missing in Judges 6:14. The Lord did not answer Gideon's why question that he had answered it and that he had asked in verse 13. Now, what had he asked in verse 13? He said, why then is all this befallen us? Why are all these tragedies coming upon us? All right. So, here's the point of that. Who is answerable to whom? That's the question. Who is answerable to whom? God is not answerable to us. Gideon asked God that question, why has this befallen us? And God did not answer that question. As a matter of fact, we are told we are answerable to the Lord, not he to us. Our question, our why question, will not always be answered. And sometimes the Lord will only tell us what's next. Yet Gideon was attentive to the Lord's will, and therefore we must be also. Like all of us, Gideon experienced both successes and failures. And it's funny when you read the story. He will be a judge for 40 years after he wins this battle. Read the story. He starts out with 32,000 men and goes down to 300 and wins a battle. And the odds are like 150 against 1. I don't think you could beat 150 people if you were one person. But after he defeats them, Israel will have peace for 40 years. But guess what happens to Gideon? He dies. And then guess what happens? His son, who saw everything, takes rule. And what does he do? He does evil in the sight of the Lord. And they go right back into, when you read Judges, that's exactly what has happened. When that judge follows God, usually, God apparently likes 40 as a number. And usually there's 40 years of prosperity. But as soon as that one dies, it's like they never saw a thing of it, and they went right back in their old habits, instantly. So sometimes we do have failures, and sometimes we do have successes. So it's been said, there's two ways to learn things. One is by wisdom, and one is by experience. Wisdom we learn from others' mistakes. Experience we learn from our own mistakes. And we don't want that as a teacher, I can tell you that. Because you might end up doing something, you break a leg or get paralyzed when someone else has done something, so you want to learn from what someone else has done, and you don't want to do the same thing because of stubbornness. That's kind of like parents saying, don't touch that hot eye on the stove, and what do you want to do? Touch that hot eye, and what happens to you? You've got a burnt hand, so to speak, or whatever. So we have to watch, how do we want to learn? But the life of Gideon is recorded that we might learn from Gideon's successes and failures. While his call differs from that of Christians, Gideon's life still has much to teach us. The Lord still calls us to serve. He still says that he is with us. But here is the more important question. Are we with God? Are we walking hand in hand? Shirley, can you close us in prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we just come to you thanking you that we were able to be out this morning and be here for the study and to learn more about you, Lord. We just thank you so much for everything that you do for us. We thank you for allowing Mindy to be our teacher and to make her study so that we can understand. We just thank you for that opportunity. And Lord, we ask you to be with our pastor today as he delivers the message, and may we all be able to be back again next Sunday. We just know that we need to be here every time that we can be, and we just thank you that we're able to be at this time. Lord, I just ask you to be with everyone in class and touch us all and bless us where we need blessings. Which in your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.